So, welcome to this film produced by Loving Men. This is based on an online seminar that we organised in November 2020 in the depths of the pandemic. About 90 people came, actually from all over the world, although mostly from the UK. And it was, we called it Growing Up Gay. So it was a conversation with the author Walt Odets about his book, Out of the Shadows, which was written in 2019. So, first of all, welcome to Walt, who is a psychotherapist working in California. I believe, Walt, you've worked in California for a very long time with hundreds, if not thousands, of gay men. Is that correct?
I've worked with hundreds, and I've worked with thousands, more in book form and talks and other things like that. In 1995, I had a book released that was called "In the Shadow
Hmm.
of the Epidemic," and that they sold rather quickly, about 20,000 copies of that.
Hmm.
And it was it was a book about the HIV epidemic, essentially,
Hmm.
and both the positive and negative people in that epidemic.
So today we're here to talk about your book Out of the Shadows, which covers many ideas about the experiences of gay men and development over the life cycle. Throughout the book, you refer to Erik Erikson's theories about life stages. And when we were planning this, you told me that Erik was actually a family friend. Could you tell us a bit more about that, how you knew him?
I met him as a teenager. Um, I was 16 and my father had died, and I spent a great deal of time with family friends. The wife in the family was a psychoanalyst and a friend of Eric's, and I met Eric's when I was about 16 or 17. As a result of that, when I started graduate school in I was 31, I think, when I started graduate school for psychology. And Eric happened to be living north of San Francisco in a little town called Tiburon on the north edge of San Francisco Bay, and or sort of the edge and the north end of the Golden Gate Bridge. And so I found out he was living there, and I would go over on Thursdays. I forget why it was Thursdays, but on Thursdays, and sit and talk with him about the work I was doing, and often have dinner with him. His wife Joan was someone I also liked very much.
Your book really focuses on the experience of gay men, but I imagine that quite a lot of what you say would be relevant to other groups of people, including bi men, for example, or men from other sexual minorities. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I talk mostly about gay men because that's where most of my experience has been,
Mm.
both for myself as well as for the people I've worked with. And sure, I mean, gay, queer, trans, I mean, all of those things are pertinent.
We're going to come on and talk about Eric's 8 stages of development, human development, in a moment, and you're going to talk us through each stage briefly. Um, as I understand it, this model was at the heart of Eric's work, and basically he proposed 8 dilemmas, struggles, journeys that each person deals with at different phases of their life. We could call them existential dilemmas, perhaps. Would you agree with that? That's a good way of framing his model.
I think it's very complex because there is this idea that these stages take place at certain times, and then when one walks out of that stage and into the next stage and so on, and that sort of stepladder look. And I think, in fact, all of those follow all of us through our lives, and that if we talk in infancy about trust and mistrust, as adults, we often have an issue there.
I'm actually going to put up a graphic now of the 8 stages, and it is like a step ladder. And I know you have reservations about that image. So can you just tell us what, before we dive into each stage, what about this step ladder are you not comfortable with, or does it not feel quite representational of what Eric was saying?
What bothers me about the graphic is that it looks as if somehow we progress upwards and we resolve the problems in our lives, and it's not that simple. A great deal of this is about circling back. So, someone in their 90s, they have a loss of a partner, um, and they cycle back to many of those developmental stages in an effort to solve that. So it's not, I'm saying that it's not a single progressive movement in the way that this implies. And it's also the angle of the thing suggests that somehow each of those stages is better than the previous one and incorporates the previous ones. And it's just simply more complex than that. So
I remember you said life is more like this,
yes,
and
yeah,
less like this.
yeah. We circle back on things. And I think that all of us at some point circle back, for example, onto the uh, trust versus mistrust with others, with guilt, with a sense of inferiority or failure, with shame. All of those things come up in our mid-age and later lives. And so, yeah, I don't, the progressive thing, it's got that arrow over on the right side. It looks like you get shot off in a rocket and everything is fine, which, doesn't work that way. So does that, did I answer enough of that question about, uh, let me just read a little thing here. This is from the book and it's very short. In Erickson's 8 stages, each stage is a period in human development with a central developmental challenge or task for which there is a spectrum of possible outcomes, or as Erickson calls them, attitudes. Each task, and I'll describe very briefly the 8 of them, first presents itself more or less chronologically, beginning in infancy and continuing throughout childhood, adolescence, and early, middle, and late adulthood. So those are the thing that's important to remember is that we don't simply go through a period of life, resolve the issue. We don't resolve the conflict between initiative and guilt. It's something that comes up. And I think that, and I may be a little repeating myself, but Eric was a psychosocial psychologist, which was something new. Freud was a psychological, had a psychological scheme. But I think that it's important to remember that in each of these 8 stages, what is called a resolution for developmental challenges helps clarify potential vulnerabilities and so on. But gay people there's more complexity in growing up gay, and the various stages are very often more traumatic for gay people as they are for physically or sexually abused children and so on. So I think that the significance of the 8 stages for gay people is quite important.
So, are you going to say a little bit about each one, Walt?
Yeah, I can do that, and let's try to keep it brisk so that I don't take up too much of the time here. And I will just identify them I'll identify the names as I go through them here. Again, I'm sorry, but I have to work from notes because of the book. So the first stage, and it's a stage pretty much that occurs pretty much during infancy, the first year or two. But it's about trust versus mistrust, what Eric calls basic trust versus basic mistrust. He's talking about a foundation or a kind of confidence in others, and that he the and he says here, and I'm going to just read you a short quotation. Even under the most favorable circumstances, this stage seems to introduce into psychic life a sense of inner division and universal nostalgia for a paradise forfeited. It's a very beautiful line. It is against this powerful combination of a sense of having been deprived, of having been divided, and of having been abandoned that basic trust must maintain itself throughout life. So
I imagine that you're talking about the womb, being in the womb, when you say divided and so on and abandoned. Is that what you mean?
no, it's about a parent a parent simply walks out of the room and an infant can feel abandoned.
Okay.
And you can spend the whole day with the infant, put him down in the bed and walk out of the room and he'll start screaming. I've heard that a thousand times. And so it's something that we never grow out of. And as adults with a partner, we can easily feel abandoned. And I think it comes from an idealization of how relationships work. That, for example, love can be unconditional. And the only unconditional love I've ever seen is from a dog. It simply isn't, it isn't with the complexity of the human brain and the internal life. It doesn't really allow that.
Abandonment issues that many of us feel when we start intimate relationships or during them, are you saying that might go right back to this early stage?
Yes. If you think of an infant in a crib, let's say a 2-month-old infant, and the parent brings the infant in, holds him or her, puts him down, talks to him, and then walks out of the room. And the child starts screaming, crying and screaming. The child feels abandoned at that point. And that's, of course, extreme because an infant has not been taught to accept some of those activities. But I think it's something that we experience all through life.
Shall we move on to autonomy and shame?
Yes, we definitely should. Thank you for bringing it up. So this, Eric calls it autonomy versus shame and doubt, and I would call it autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. I think it's very much about self-doubt. So this period of early psychological development falls between the ages of, let's say, 1 and 3 or 1 and 4 years of age, occurs when the infant first, this is important now, occurs, and it begins when the infant first experiences muscular maturation and some physical mobility. And in his mobility, he is experiencing a sense of autonomy and his first sense of personal choice and will. He's able to crawl or walk on his own. And the issue here is that some parents are fearful for the child's safety, or parents often feel dismissed or abandoned when a child moves away from them and doesn't allow growth and exploration. And a child with that kind of autonomy very naturally wants to explore it. And when parents don't allow that, the child feels shame. Children feel shame about abandoning a parents. So, and they also, when the parent is not supportive of that kind of an effort to explore, a child can get too far out on the limb and feel in over his head. So that's where a lot of the self-doubt comes from. If children are not supported by parents, they're left to manage their own lives, and they're not capable of that. So that's a very important root for self-doubt.
So Erickson is saying that all children wrestle with shame and doubt.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Um, Doubt would be if you take when Erickson is talking about very early childhood, like maybe beginning with age of 3 or something like that, and the child clearly has doubt about himself. He's not competent in a way that older people around him are. He can't possibly be, and he knows that. Um, he's learning to walk, at the age of 2, and I think that the shame is about being inadequate, that one simply is not competent in a way that older people are.
I,
And again, we go through life feeling shame about certain things, doubt about ourselves, our abilities, all of those kinds of things. So I don't think that, even though it starts in according to Eric, in early childhood, um, I don't. It's certainly not something that we just get over.
yeah.
So
I,
if someone tells you that he has no doubt about himself, there's a problem there because um, he's not paying attention. He's using some kind of denial.
I pick up particularly on these two words because they're so key for so many gay men: shame and self-doubt.
Okay. Yeah.
What do you think about the connection?
Well, yeah, I think I just left that out in what I was talking about there, but in I think I'm talking about the U.S., which I know better as compared to the U.K. Um, Certainly, families who disapprove of gay children dominate the culture in the U.S. There are many sophisticated families, the ones who read the New York Review of Books and things, who, accept the gay children, but a lot of families reject that. I meet a lot of gay people in their 20s or even in their 30s and 40s who have never come out to their parents, who are still hiding that. So um, they, clearly they have some issue of shame and doubt. And, to be someone uh, who can't reveal himself to his family, that's shame.
Mm, mm, mm. Okay.
The dog is walking into the room. He just heard me talk about that. So,
Unconditionally lovely.
yeah. So, and then we'll move on to the next one, which is initiative versus guilt. So I point out that shame is, let me just describe the difference between shame and guilt. I think it's an important distinction. This shift of focus from shame to guilt and this developmental structure that Eric made, the shift to guilt starts around the age of 5 or 6, somewhere in there. And guilt is considered developmental progress over shame. So if shame is about hiding from the gaze of others to protect oneself, guilt is remorse about behavior that might harm others. So these are two very different kinds of issues. The developmental challenge for this age of initiative versus guilt is the struggle between initiative on the one hand, meaning activation and ambitious goals, and guilt on the other hand. So initiative is built on an earlier gained sense of autonomy.
So is Erickson saying that as a child gains a sense of self and autonomy at maybe 3 or 4 years old, they start to take bigger risks, and either they achieve those and feel a sense of initiative, or they fail at them and feel a sense of guilt?
Well, I think the first thing I think of in that period, and again, we're talking about um, probably 4-year-olds, and they've learned to walk, and the ability to stand up on 2 legs and walk gives them a certain kind of freedom and independence that they're ambivalent about, and many parents are ambivalent about allowing their children to simply walk around on their own. And what they feel that they're doing when they walk that way is that they're abandoning their parent. So we've now flipped the abandonment,
Hmm.
and and they feel guilt about that. They feel guilt about abandoning the parent. And I've seen that when I take my dog to the I'm forgetting the name of the thing. There's a place where you can take dogs, and people have picnics and all of that. I see that in the children and the parents.
Hmm.
There are some parents who are very anxious about a child getting up and walking away from them. Some will even chase the child to stay behind him or her. So it's rather complicated. But what's essentially going on there is that a child is becoming an independent human being who's going to grow up and be an adult, just like their current adult.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And either they're supported in that and they feel good about autonomy, or there's this more guilt trippy anxiety around their autonomy
Yeah.
and their ability to
Yeah.
go out into the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they're ambivalent about the autonomy.
Hmm.
The next one we have is industry versus inferiority. And Eric is here just discussing developmental challenges between the ages of, let's say, 6 and 11 years old, somewhere in there. And by doing that, he's touching on a period that's often significant for gay boys. These are the years during which gay children are often first aware of feeling different. And I have the word different in quotation marks, feeling different from other boys. And very easily experience that difference as some kind of inadequacy or inferiority. It's a very delicate time that for gay children that really needs attention. The idea of industry is difficult because there are things that boys do and things that boys don't do in terms of conventional social values. And so for boys, for gay boys, it's difficult. For example, producing things is often encouraged through competitive activities such as sports, and a lot of gay boys aren't interested in that. I mean, I always got out of what we called physical education here. If they were having a baseball thing, I'd come up with an excuse for not doing it. So.
I'm wondering if we just take a pause here and see if there are any questions or reflections. I mean, I'm just thinking as you're talking, all of these things you've talked about already seem to me so relevant to the gay experience, the queer experience. This last one you were talking about, industry versus inferiority, it puts me in mind of my two brothers who would come home from football on Sundays with trophies and medals, endless bits of plastic that went up on a shelf and were celebrated in some way. And I didn't, because I wasn't into that stuff. In fact, I played piano, and it wasn't the same. It wasn't the industry that was recognised, I guess, in our social milieu and in our family. But all of these things, initiative, like the first steps gay boys take to take initiative around our sexualities or our attractions, and then what often happens to us, and the guilt that then ensues, or the shame and doubt that ensues, and the ultimate mistrust of life, of people, of each other, of our parents, of our families. Seems to me in many aspects, even before we've even got anywhere near adulthood, that seem very relevant. So are there any questions, any thoughts, any reflections from anyone as we're going? Any need for clarification? We're covering quite a lot of ground here.
I think one of the reasons why I've always liked Erickson more than any other developmentalist is because of what you said at the beginning, Walt, about each challenge being on a kind of gyre rather than a ladder. It's circular. and the challenges come up again and again and again, and over our lives. The idea of resolution is very nice, but over our lives, we very often, we always come up against the same material or the same basic challenges. And Erickson accommodates that with the idea of compensation or remediation. And that's very often what we as therapists are doing with our clients, remediating those irresolutions.
There is an idea that we move through these stages, we resolve them, we go on, and that, I'm sorry, the dog is, sweetie, go lie down. That any return to any of those early stages is somehow a failure, a regression. This idea that people regress, and in fact, I don't think it's a regression at all. I think it's a re-exploration of areas that now have pertinence at this later point in life, and that the objective there is that we go back into that earlier stage. We try to understand how it relates, and then we come out with at a slightly different trajectory from the way we came in. So the idea isn't just to go back, let's say, for a child to return to it and sulk. It's to try to understand what that feeling is and why we present ourselves that way, and making that little bit of an adjustment. So it's something that we cycle like this. I did this with Tim the other day when we were talking about it. It's much more this kind of a process through life. So there's an overall trend, but we're backing up all the time and examining earlier things. So I'm just trying to give you my angle on what you said, because I do think it's important. And incidentally, Eric was himself that way. Eric would talk about his own shame or his own embarrassment about things, or he was not a person who wanted to present himself as resolved and clean, resolved and solid. He was very open about all this.
Nick has made a comment about a lack of age-appropriate rites of passages for queer boys compared to heteronormative boys. Any thoughts about that, Walt?
Tell me the first part of the sentence.
He says, for me, it speaks to not having age-appropriate rites of passage for queer boys that other boys would generally
this is a huge topic. I mean, for any of you who've read it, and I know that Tim has, it's a huge part of the discussion in the book. One of the most disturbing things is that teenage boys, both because of peers as well as just the social organization of thing, are not allowed to have relationships with each other. Now this is beginning to change, but historically, and I still get it, I see in therapy a handful of young men in their 20s, and they're still dealing with this issue. They haven't been allowed relationships, so they end up having sex, which is a disconnected kind of exchange, and it's very damaging because as adults they still have no idea about relationships. Those relationships being encouraged in heterosexual kids, where a mother will talk to a son and say, when you get older and you get married, you marry Jill, and things will work out. But boys don't have that kind of support, and there are an awful lot of older men, in their 20s and older, who just have no idea about what a relationship is. And to give you a very succinct example, a young man, he's in 27 or 28 years old. I recently asked him about whether or not he had ever thought about, he's very sexual, but it's this kind of sort of sports sex. And I asked him if he had ever had an experience of sex as an emotional connection to another person, or an emotional exchange. And he looked at me, he was kind of surprised, and he said, I don't know, it's just a thing you do, isn't it? And it had never occurred to him that sex might be an exchange of feelings. So I think that's a terrible deprivation, that forbidding of relationships. And I see Bernie is raising his hand.
I mean, Bernie, do you want to unmute? And
Yeah, I'm a bit confused because these classifications, in some ways, I would say, for example, industry versus inferiority is a man-made construct or concept. It's not a biological concept, is it? It's not like the biological stages as you age and you grow and then you come in, because industry versus inferiority, I mean, I just think even with that point alone, if you were shown lots of love and had brilliant connection with your parents when you were a child, so you would grow in confidence because you had that early connection that you were, you know, longing for, and you got that, and you had a great nurturing upbringing. So when you come to something like industry and inferiority, that's like what your reaction is. So in other words, industry is the boys going out playing football and coming home with their cups, and somehow you feel inferior because you weren't doing that. But if you were a loved child, you were supported as a child, you wouldn't feel inferior at all, would you? You'd say, so what? You know, you just brush it off. So I don't quite understand whether these are kind of like man-made sort of things where it's been analyzed. This is what you go through in this stage, because I don't see a biological thing in that. I just see a statement: industry versus inferiority.
okay, thanks,
Well,
Bernie.
Yeah. What you're seeing here is what I've been talking about is maybe 2% of what's in that chapter about Erickson in the book, because of the time. You know, we have 3 hours here. So let me try to put it succinctly and see if it helps. The relationship between I'm forgetting the word he uses, activity or
Industry.
Industry, yeah. The industry is that when children feel shame or feel inferiority, they don't go out and explore the world and do things. And this is a period when children go out and explore things. They learn how to ride the bike, they learn how to dig a hole, how to make a snowman, to, you know, all of these kinds of things. And inferior children isolate themselves. So they don't allow themselves out in the world. They don't allow themselves to explore, to make mistakes, and then try things again. So all of that's really what he's talking about there. And I think in what I said just now, I understand your reaction to it. It doesn't quite clarify that.
That's a good clarification. Thank you. Yeah.
I think I want to read a few of the things people are writing just in a moment, but it's interesting that there's another step to the story about my brother, because in a particularly cruel encounter we had, even though I was very loved in my family and I did a lot of cooking with my mum, and you know, there was a lot of room in my family to not be gender normal or normative. And we lived in a context where there was still very strong messaging. And we had this horrible conversation once where we were talking about who was better at something, or who was, you know, he was so good at football. And I said, well, I'm good at the piano. And he said, yeah, but the difference is I don't want to play the piano. And he named something about the culture that we lived in, because it was true. I wanted to be good at football and he didn't want to be good at piano. But anyway, let me read a few of the things people have said, because there's some lovely things in here. Ben says, I work in a primary school and I witnessed some of the boys already reporting feeling inferiority because they don't like PE or are being teased by their peers. Peter Connolly says, the trust-mistrust stage makes me think of attachment theory. Any thoughts on how attachment plays out in the gay developmental experience? Another little encyclopedia of information. Maybe Walt has thoughts. I'll just read a few, and then if you have any thoughts, Walt, you can add them. Is there a sense of approval validation needed from primary caregivers? For example, the development of relationships with the masculine, fathers, brothers. That's from Sanjay. John says, wow, not being allowed to have relationships. Never thought of it that way. Craig has a response to Bernie. I felt love at some times and not at others, particularly from my father. I felt progressively abandoned as my behaviours became more visible and less like my two brothers. And Diego, all the way from Buenos Aires in Argentina, we all grow up not only in the context of a loving or non-loving supporting family, but also in the context of a social and cultural construct society. The child may have been immensely loved in the microcosm of the family, but not in the context of society. Thank you, that's very, very clear. Any comments or thoughts about any of that, Walt, before we move on?
Well, I can only remember the last one, which I think is important. Which is that I think that the support of the family, the support and acceptance of the family with a gay child is by far the most important issue, and much more powerful than any social recognition. So we have, in the United States now, if you're gay, you can get married, or I think it is that way at the moment. It might not last, but it doesn't resolve the problems with difficult families, unsupportive families, hostile families, stigmatizing families. So I think that the family is by far the most important. That's again something I discuss a lot in the books. It sounds like Tim had that kind of family. I also had that kind of family. My father couldn't have cared less whether I was gay or not. And he wanted me to either be an artist or do something that helped other people. That was about the only thing he ever asked of me. And
so I'm going to share the visual again, because we did industry and versus inferiority. So let's move on to identity versus role confusion.
That we're talking there about adolescents and teenagers, and so Eric defines the onset of this identity versus role confusion issue as starting around the ages of 12 or 13 during puberty, and it is the end of childhood and the beginning of youth. What we call youth, and it's a point at which a child takes an identity, which is largely an identity in the context of the family, and has to then find an identity in a peer group. And it's this thing we see all the time about adolescent kids developing anger, rejecting family, and so on. They're doing it because they have to make this shift to a peer group. The problem for gay kids is that it can be very hard to even express or reveal your identity as a person who's interested, let's say, in other boys, and therefore make it much more difficult to be involved with peers. So again, this is a very complicated time of life for kids, and certainly if a child was aware that he was different but didn't understand how he was different, or didn't understand the significance of his difference at this age, let's say starting at 12 or 13, he's going to be very aware that he's different from other kids and that he has a problem. So I think I'll just leave that there for now.
And well, can I just add then? So, and if he's lucky, then he has a sense of who he is, and if he's not, then he's very confused. And that's the difference, is it, between a sense of his identity versus a lot of confusion around his identity.
Confusion is, so let's say you have that supportive family, you go home and you're a gay kid, but then you go back to school on Monday, and who are you then? That's very confusing. Yeah. And I mean, of course, there were all kinds of other confusions, but that one is sort of fundamental.
Okay, let's move on to intimacy versus isolation.
Yeah, another really important one. So this is what Erickson would define as this is intimacy versus isolation. This is what Erickson would define as his first fully adult developmental period. And he defines the period as being roughly between the ages of 18 and 35. So it clearly is during this period that we first grapple with the challenges of adult intimacy. And Erickson tells us that intimacy, that the capacity for intimacy is built on foundations of reasonably well accomplished self-identity. So he's kind of carrying over a bit of the earlier stuff. There are so many issues, but I think in gay men, as well as in straight people, the emotional intimacy too often feels like a threat, that it threatens to subsume us. And human lives always, in intimate human lives, always tread some delicate, ever-shifting kind of often contentious line between independence and connection that we have to give up something for a relationship, that we have to compromise with others during a relationship, and that we're uncomfortable with the conflict. It feels like a conflict. And I think that, and I will just throw in here that the intimacy versus isolation is a very significant issue in the context of the HIV epidemic that started in 1981. And I won't elaborate much on that here unless someone wants to talk about it. But let me just see if there's anything else there. Yeah, I think that's enough here now, but I'm happy if it comes up in conversation.
Sure. Just a note from Nick here. He says, for me, this tends to be where we often split sex and love, not quite believing that the two can coexist in the same person, people.
Well, that's too bad. I mean, yeah, I know exactly what he's talking about. We do often feel that, but that's a part of how we're brought up, and about the identities that we carry and so on. I know I had a little personal story. A guy I met, his name was Tim, incidentally, many years ago, and we met at a large party, and we did go back. He had an apartment in San Francisco. We did go back to his apartment and have sex, and there was just something I liked about the guy. I mean, we just liked each other a lot, and we had sex, and we talked a bit about his background. He grew up in his parents were Christian missionaries, so you can imagine his being gay didn't really go over well in that household, and I think we fell in love with each other over a period of several months. And he announced to me at dinner one night, you do know that I can't have sex with someone I love. And I was kind of stunned. I was maybe 30 years old at that point. And what he meant was that having sex sullied this important relationship. So that's disturbing. Yeah. Did I respond to the question that had been raised there?
Yeah, I don't think it was a question. It was just echoing what you're saying, really, that for a lot of people there's a split. And I guess if a gay man has grown up feeling bad about himself sexually and he falls in love with somebody, what you're saying with your Tim was that he couldn't hold those two things together. He had to separate them. Yes.
Yeah. It's very common.
We could stay there, but tell us about generativity versus stagnation.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you something that's important about that, because when Eric first wrote this, he talked about generativity as just what it sounds like about raising children and extending human life through the raising of children. So generativity at that time meant giving birth and raising children. And he was very ashamed of that. And I asked why, and he said because it leaves out gay people. And I never should have written that in that way. And he then talked about so the implication in the title, generativity versus stagnation, implies that if you don't have a family, you're not doing anything with your life. And it's why he was so bothered by that. And then he was sort of quiet for a minute, and then he looked at me. He said, in my life, gay people are the most generative, most talented people I know. And they are able to do that because they don't have to take care of a family. So, and I may be off, a bit offline there, but and so Eric was talking about it, this issue of generativity versus stagnation, approximately from the ages of 35 to 65, and that. And I'm now quoting from him, generativity is about establishing and guiding the next generation. And I think that's important and useful. And incidentally, I think it is for gay men. There's a remarkable deficit of older gay men mentoring younger gay men. And it's in relationships of friendships. And so again, I don't know, I could go on forever about that issue, but it's I think it's important to remember that generativity is not the marker.
As in reproduction. I mean, although of course some of us do have children, but you're saying, are you saying that it's to do with our work, our output, what we're contributing to life and to
Yes, all of it. That all falls under generativity. That's what Eric was apologizing for, because he didn't really say that in the book.
Just a couple of agreed. I think it was to do with what you were saying about gay elders. We are totally agree. We are starved for gay elders. Men of my generation should have had elders, but were probably wiped out in the AIDS crisis.
Yeah. So no, I see these are popping up at the bottom of my screen now. There are 26 of them. So the last two, which I'm sort of forgetting, but yes, I mean, Eric died. The period of time that I told you that I was going there on Thursdays, Eric was already, I think, 83 or 84 years old. So I don't think he was going to back up and redo the book at that point. And he initially wrote that book, I believe, in 1952 or 1953. So I think one has to put that into account. But I can tell you that he was very loving with me and very supportive, and he was not a homophobe for sure. Well, so we're getting a whole bunch of stuff here. Can't keep up with you. Are you keeping up with them?
Maybe his plan was for you to write the book, as you have. So he didn't need to.
Okay.
Yeah, people are just echoing a lot of what's being said. But would you just talk us through integrity versus despair, so then we can open it up for more of a conversation?
Well, yeah. I mean, I just read from Eric, and then I'll just give you a personal experience that would describe this. So he's talking about people, let's say over 65, give or take. But and the quotation from Eric is, only in him who in some way had taken care of things and people and had adapted himself to the triumphs and disappointment inherent in being, might he gradually ripen the fruit of those previous 7 stages. And he's talking there essentially about a resolved, relatively resolved, happy life. And
Could you read the beginning of that line again? Only in.
only in this is odd writing. He did some odd writing, but I'm reading it as he wrote it. Only in him who in some way has taken care of things and people and has adapted himself to the triumphs and disappointment inherent to being, uh, may he gradually ripen the fruit of these 7 stages.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, he was a beautiful writer, but the writing was it was unfamiliar.
A lot of poetry in it. It reminds me of Eric Fromm as well, the art of loving.
Uh-huh.
The emphasis being on that most of us put the emphasis on how do we get love, and he's talking about giving love. He's talking about loving, taking care of people and things.
Yeah,
is how we ripen. It's a lovely.
So the experience that I just personal thing I want to relate, and I can do it fairly quickly, is that in the 1980s and up through the mid to later 90s, I did a lot of work with people with HIV. And I think over that period, just in terms of my therapy practice, that I had 125 people die. One of them literally sitting in the office while we were meeting. And I often went to people's homes or to the hospitals when they were too ill to come in. And I saw a remarkable division in these groups, that men who felt that they had accomplished things in life, and particularly those men who had requited love, had been in love at some point in their lives. Those men could accept dying. I'm sorry, it's bothering me. It takes me back that, I sat by the beds when people told me this kind of stuff. The men who had not had an experience of being in love, the men who had not felt that they'd accomplished something important in their lives, were very angry about dying and fought it often to ridiculous levels. That's what Eric is talking about in that last stage. That one has to have a certain realistic sense of having used a life well in order to give up that life. And I saw people on both sides of it. The guy who died in my room, I'll tell you about him. He was a doctor. He was a pediatric oncologist, and in New York City. And he came out to San Francisco to die here. Somehow felt it would be more appropriate. But he was very unhappy with his career. He hadn't done enough for children with the oncology. And he was disappointed in himself. And he was very angry about it. And he was at a point where, he visited me twice a week. He had an attendant who carried him up the stairs to my office, put him in a chair, hooked him up to 2 pumps. And he sat there in the chair and often fell asleep or was unable to follow. But he was very angry about his life and about losing it. And as a physician, he was constantly dictating how things were done, having fights with other medical people. And one day we weren't talking. We often didn't talk, but it was important to sit in the room with me. And I realized that he was dead. I walked over to the chair and I took his pulse. And his attendant, a very sweet guy, a gigantic guy, like a football player, I said, I'm making the name up, I think John is dead. And he stood up, the attendant stood up and said, I'm not surprised, but this is where he would have wanted to die.
Making meaning of his life.
yeah,
and
trying to,
sharing his feelings. Yeah.
yeah, trying to make meaning. Yeah, it's amazing how these. I'm talking about this was 35 years ago, and it makes me tear up to remember him sitting in that show.
So you've covered a lot in this last little section, and including the impact of the whole HIV epidemic as well as these stages. So which obviously played an enormous role in many of our lives, and still does. So there's one last idea we want to cover before we end the first part, which is a way of summarizing the 8 stages.
That this developmental process, in I'm simplifying it now to make it more intelligible. This developmental process is about an initially self-acceptance, reasonable self-acceptance, and oh, there we go. Tim is a genius. He's done a lot of work on this. Self-acceptance, which allows the development of self-confidence and exploration that helps reinforce the self-confidence. And through that self-confidence, life that's realized, where you become more or less who you want to be. You've done more or less what you wanted to do. And I think that's a very simple version of what Eric was talking about, but it's useful for people to kind of think of it that way. And and when I talk about that, I'm not talking about complete self-acceptance, because no one on his feet really has that, or complete self-confidence, because we have to, the way that we learn, the way that we grow is by making mistakes. We have to be willing to accept mistakes. So the self-confidence is moderated by other issues. And the self-realization, well, none of us have perfect lives. I don't think anyone is completely satisfied with how he has lived his life, but we can feel pretty good about it, I think. So in case, I wanted to just throw that in to kind of close up Eric's work.
So, welcome back to part 2. This part of the event opened up a discussion with all the people that were present, and we're grateful for their permission to use their thoughts and contributions. So let's have a few more questions, comments, thoughts. We can have them in the chat box. I'll read a few out. Or if you'd like to speak, it's quite nice to speak, because we get to relate a little bit. Just unmute one at a time. Don't worry if you bump into somebody, and share something, a question or a thought.
Walt, when I was reading your idea that these 8 stages are actually, I suppose, cyclical rather than something that things that stack up one on top of each other. I found that comforting and inspiring, because I think that as you get later on in life, I think it's very easy to think that maybe you have just missed out on your chance because you don't feel that some of these things have been resolved in your earlier life. And I think the notion that actually you can still go back and still work your way through them, and maybe go back more than once, I think, as I said, I think is very inspiring.
Thank you, Ian. Anybody else want to say something?
I wondered if you would talk about your concept of the 3 generations of gay men, because I found that immensely interesting, and we haven't yet covered that. Could you say some more about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much unrelated to the Erickson material, but yeah, I think we've got 3 very different groups, and a great deal of those differences come out of where people are historically placed in terms of the HIV epidemic, and that people, kind of making the figures up, but people are over 55, 50, maybe now 50 years old. They lived through the epidemic from the beginning, from 81 on. And we went through from 81 to 84. We didn't even know what was being transmitted. And then it was April of 85 before we knew how to test for infection. And so these older people went through 4 or 5 years assuming they had whatever it was that all these people had. And they watched people drop dead right and left because we didn't even know how to treat a pneumonia at that time. And it was a terrible trauma. There are now many people who did contract the virus who are alive. In the US, at least, we call them long-term survivors. And clearly in 96, we had the addition of medications that, have pretty much stopped HIV deaths, but there are a lot of side effects, and it's not a panacea, the medical thing here. So that's one group. Then we have a younger group that might run in that range of 35 to 50 or something like that. And there was a curious thing about them. They were still children or very young teenagers while the academic, I started to say academic, the epidemic, they were aware it was going on. I mean, I had a guy once tell me, he's now 45 years old, tell me that when he was a kid, he walked in the living room and his parents were watching TV, and there was a frighteningly emaciated man lying on a hospital bed, and the boy's father said, "Boy, look at that poor bastard there in that bed." And this kid, who was 9 years old, he said to me, "When I saw that, I realized that was about me. It never occurred to me I was gay. I never had that concept. I didn't quite know what it meant to be gay, but I knew that image was about me."
Yeah, I've worked with many people in this period that were becoming sexual during that very early period of seeing everybody dying, and this was their future. So I relate to that. Yeah.
So, and then there's a younger group that didn't see any of this, and it's like history. It's like, to them, it's like what the Great Depression was to me. But not to have lived through that. But there are real problems there. I mean, there still is HIV being transmitted, particularly in disadvantaged populations that don't have the money for just ordinary medical care, don't have the money for pre-exposure prophylaxis. In my opinion, is that the U.S. government should have someone on every corner giving out PrEP tablets. I mean, why not?
Well, we have the capacity to kill the virus off now, don't we, to eradicate it?
Yeah,
its transmission if we were making this available really easily.
And the PrEP is virtually 100% effective if it's used properly, and I don't mean every day. I mean, we've got a 2-on-1 deal going on here.
Sure.
There's a few comments coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. On the chat about the idea of gay elderhood, gay eldership, and people wondering about what that would look like in their lives. And then Paul says, "I see a council of gay elders, wise and experienced." Others say, "Fantastic idea, Paul." Other people really thanking you for your book. And then we'll just read these two, and then we'll head towards taking a break shortly. But you mentioned disadvantaged or marginalised gay men there. Can you break that down a bit for us? Which groups of men are you thinking of particularly, and what are some of the challenges that you see them facing?
Yeah, well, it's a very complicated question that you're asking there, because it's so variable among different groups. I think that I'm talking now about the U.S. again, which is the one I know most about and have the most experience with. that firstly, there is, it's moving now away from that, but the sort of social construct about people and how they live has been anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-everything, other than sort of conventional people. And I think that so a gay child who, beginning is aware of being gay, let's say from the first time between 7 years old and 13 years old, suddenly finds himself an outsider. And so people like that, children like that, when that 13-year-old or 14-year-old gets into high school, he's marginalized. And in general, gay people are marginalized. And it depends on the family, and it depends on the social environment in which the child has grown up, or in which the schooling is done. And then in terms of disadvantages and marginalization, there are in the United States, which is a very wealthy country, there's a huge amount of poverty in the United States, and I think it's sort of ignored because people don't really want to deal with it. And to give you an example, I mean, living in Berkeley, I find people sleeping on the sidewalk, in cold weather, and so that's, I'd call that disadvantage and marginalization of a person. But in my experience, so you've got that whole layer of the disadvantage and marginalization of simply being gay, but then on top of that, there are racial issues, and that gay Black men, I think, have the most difficult time. They feel that because I've worked with some, not that many, there aren't that many Black people who work in therapy with therapists. It's just sort of not part of the culture. But with the Black men that I have worked with in therapy, I find it, they very often come from families who have little income. Their medical care is very poorly done. They often can't afford to pay for medical care, and then in the U.S. everyone pays for it. It's not like the U.K. And they can, for example, they very often don't have enough money to buy pre-exposure prophylaxis medication, and so I think that they're at higher risk because of that.
And so there's an intersection there of sexuality, socioeconomics, like class, and then race as well, because I guess that also would apply to white men in poverty, that they wouldn't have access to those things either.
Yes, but they can get medical care more readily than Black people can. And I have to remind people, I hope I'm not taking up too much time with it, but that the United States is the product of a bunch of Europeans moving in, killing the Native Americans, kidnapping Black people from Africa, bringing them over on a ship where half of them die because they're not feeding the Black people on the ship. When they land, when the half who are still alive, land on American soil, they're sold to other people as slaves. This is the history of the United States. It's absolutely unforgivable. Yet there is still, with all the effort that's been put into demarginalizing Black people, it's still there. I see it all the time, and to me, it's very disturbing.
Okay. time we can share something, ask something. What's around? What are you thinking about, wondering about, wanting to share?
Tim, I have a question. Hello, Walt. I have a question for you. There's a word that you use repeatedly through the book, which is authenticity, which I'm really curious about. And I'm kind of flicking through to the chapter on what's section 4, industry versus inferiority. You talk about authentic lives are internally rooted lives, and I'm curious about that. So you talk about in an authentic life, our life in the external world is relatively coherent with our internally held values and sense of self. The authentic adult life thus seeks validation first internally and only secondarily from others. And I'm really interested in that. What if you could expand on what you mean by authenticity. Yeah.
It's what we would call here, I don't know, it's a kind of slang, but someone says, so-and-so is a real person. You can feel that if a person is honest. It's about honesty in a way. It's more complex. It's more, it entails and includes more diversity of feelings. I think that that gay men, as I'm defining them, have more emotional sensibility, more emotional sensitivity, are more emotionally expressive. And it's very common, women, straight women or lesbians, are often very close friends with gay men because they share more. They share more, the sensibility, the emotional sensibility is shared. And straight men are, they're trained to be hollow. And, it's someone, I don't know how many of you follow Donald Trump, but, he's a sort of, pathological male. And I mean, he's at the worst end of the whole thing. It's bad as it's amazing one human being can incorporate all of that stupid masculine stuff. But
I wanted to ask a question, if it's possible.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, I was just thinking about, we had the conversation in the break, and we were just talking about building our confidence as ourselves, discovering ourselves back then, which is a very internal journey because you're just trying to understand about yourself. But nowadays, with the whole online culture, with this whole diversity, and we hold the social, media in our hands. So, I think our brain was never actually used to actually compare ourselves with so many people now. Because I remember growing up and just watching my surroundings and get a little bit of exploration about my surround. But nowadays, with this whole platform that we see so many streams of different, community, and we try to find that validation who we are. And that's going to be very, very difficult. I see this a lot with gay men. I used to go out and I was talking in the break. I said, I used to go out, hit in the bar, someone, and I really enjoy. Someone says, sorry, you're not my type. So I would feel upset. I would develop some kind of resilience and carry on because it's Friday night. So I still have a weekend ahead. So all those kind of skills that I used to build was very important. But nowadays, with the whole thing about we're so bombarded with so many odd options. So we postpone and have to deal with our feelings of rejection, upset, because we engage in another hookup and all things. And I can see this more and more with my clients going on, that kind of difficult sense of themselves, because they're always comparing that with so many people. And before I used to compare, but wouldn't be with people around the world, would be with a cluster where I used to hang out. So now we're comparing everyone around, and I can see more of this happening. That sense of that sense of community, that sense of the diversity, that sense of I don't know how you guys feel about working, with men have sex with men, but I feel like with this whole thing about the internet, and I work with the drug users, primarily chemsex, and when I'm stopping to address the drug use, and then all the other problems start to surfacing. And I don't know how you guys feel about that, about like creating a sense of self. You know, in Australia, Sydney, I found very, very difficult. I see in UK you have loving men, which is amazing, you know. And I don't know. I just like, I think there's a very, very, it's lacking a lot. There's about like that kind of integrity about who you are as a person, to be accepted who you are. There's always a conformity, how you wanted to fit in. That's
And
the way that I.
what I'm understanding, Daniel, is that you're talking about how the gay scene has exploded with the internet, whereas maybe there are a few hundred men used to go to a club, and that was your reference point. Now it's billions of people potentially, and that makes it even more complex for gay men to form identities, to have a sense of self. Does this make any sense to you, Walt? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are gay communities. There are people, and some of them live in close proximity, but that doesn't make for a community. I think communities are something that we create through connections, discovered connections with other individuals. So if you were to ask me about my gay community, I'd say that there are 20 of us in there, in that community, but I don't think of it as a community. And I see an awful lot of these young men that I see in therapy who move very often from the Midwest of the United States out to San Francisco to find a gay community. They don't find anything there at all in terms of community. They're a bunch of gay guys who live in the same neighborhood, but they're not included in that. They don't really belong there. But they have to find individuals, and it doesn't take many for one to have a community. If you have, I would say I have 5 or 6 very close friends with whom I would talk about anything, both about myself as well as them. That's a lot. That's a lot to have in life. But I don't want a community. I've never been a community kind of person. I'm not an organizational kind of person, and I've never sought community. I think the idea of gay community is it makes people feel supported. It makes them feel safer, more protected against others, other disapproving people. But I'm not sure it's really a thing, and I'm not sure that it really exists.
I was thinking about like on a break, we discussed about like, you know, like back a few years ago, I just remember just, you know, like getting into a bar with someone who's gonna, you wanna take me under their wings, and they would be older than me, or they would more expertise than myself, and just help me this. And I see this less happening with this community before. I think just like I took it for granted back then, but I was privileged to have people that were very, very kind with me growing up, and, you know, like, you know, me molding, mirroring, all those little things. And I don't know, maybe now the generation is different now because we have technologies. I'm not saying that they are not like that, but this is very difficult for you to try to conform when there's so many different types. Before, it was type, not as many.
Yeah, smaller communities are always more solid. And if you go in San Francisco or New York, there's a certain kind of a bar for this sort of person, a bar for that person, so on. If you go to a small town in the country and it's a gay bar, it's highly diverse and highly coherent compared to the urban get-together places. And so
I can relate to this. I mean, I certainly grew up, I came out onto a very small gay scene in Cardiff where I was at university, and you know, I had friends that I met in the pub, and we had a pub, and I do really recognize some of what you're saying, Daniel, that's gone in so many ways. And I see myself and I see other people using the apps a little bit around that. I mean, obviously the apps can have a very particular flavor and currency, but I know my gay neighbors because of Grindr and because of Scruff. They live all around me. I would never have met them unless there was a gay bar, a local gay bar. And so in a way, I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think there are ways to make local connections. And I've heard of people using the apps to do that. But it's a very different social world than the one I came into when I was 18. And we had newspapers, and we had actual newspapers that weekly would report news. You know, I was talking to a young gay man recently about something, and he didn't know a really basic fact about HIV. He didn't know what undetectable was, and he didn't know what that meant. And he doesn't have an information supply. Like, I used to read the pink paper once a week. So it's fascinating to me how technology is changing things. There's an author called Meg Wheatley who's written about how that we're now at a stage in life where most human beings on the planet have a smartphone, and that has never happened before. We've never had information flow to most human beings on the planet. This is a really unusual time, and dangerous time, and undermining and eroding time as a result. It's complex. So we don't need to go more into that now. Let's come back to other questions and thoughts. I'll just read a couple out from the notes, but if there are other people who'd like to say something, please get ready to press your button. Manny says, throughout my journey of reclaiming my identity, I came across 2 quotes which were truly inspiring and completely changed my life. Number 1, the quote is, when you are born in a world you don't fit in, it's because you're born to help create a new one. He doesn't know who that's by. And the second one, when I was in the military, they gave me a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving 1. Leonard Philip Matlovich. And Ben Campbell asked a question about death anxiety. He says, I work in oncology and I was struck by Walt's comments about fear and anxiety around death and loss. Irvin Yalom speaks about death anxiety being equal to a life not lived. Any thoughts about either of those, Walt, before we open the mics again?
Yeah, well, I think the last is important and sort of well stated. Read that again.
Irvin Yalom speaks about death anxiety being equal to a life not lived.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's because that's where we're going to end up in our lives. You know? And I think the fear of dying can constrict and actually arrest the life for the time that one actually has. I think it's a good quotation. It sounds like the kind of thing he'd write. He just lives over here across the bay.
Any other thoughts, questions?
I've got a question, if I may, for
Sure.
Walt. Walt, given that Erickson's stages were postulated and developed back then, I mean, we're talking about 60 years ago or so, and they mainly sort of aimed at following on from what Freud perhaps had done before with his psychosexual stages, but also tried to put the context of human personality development through the whole scope of life, not just until teenage years. And given that it was mainly suited at fitting what we can say is a heteronormative development, has the time come, do you feel, according to your experience, now in 2020, with all the changes that we have experienced and the changes that the new generations of new gay men are experiencing, has the time come to perhaps add to these stages? Is there scope for adding stages in between to suit and fit the gay and the queer personality development experience?
Could be, I don't know. I'd have to really give that some thought. I just don't know. I don't know how to answer that. Eric sure as hell not going to do that. and he died quite a while ago. And I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. It's just one that I'd have to give some thought to answer. I think, I mean, for me, the whole concern about, what people call sexual orientation and gender and, cisgendered as opposed to, non-gendered, all of that. It's crazy stuff. People should just be themselves. We're all different. It's I don't, the fact that we're even talking about gay people as a defined group is kind of crazy. We're human beings and we relate to different people. We express ourselves physically, sexually, all kinds of things. And it's, we're constantly trying to get out of a kind of a socially constructed maze that's got everyone lined up in a certain place. So, but yeah, I think your question is interesting, and it could be, Eric could have written it more broadly to include queer people, but I don't think he knew much about that in 1952, and people didn't talk much about it. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, thoughts?
I see a chat thing hanging down here.
Yeah, Lee says, there is something for me about how we as gay men learn to cherish the 360 versions of ourselves. And Ben says, there's a book by Daniel Levinson, The Ages of Man's Life, which adds a couple of extra stages to Erickson's.
Oh, really?
It'd be interesting, Ben, if you know what they are, if you could add them into the chat or tell us, perhaps. And Michael says, we need to complexity way beyond the binaries which constrain our identities. We need complexity way beyond the binaries that constrain our identities.
Well, I sure agree with that one. Yeah.
Can I revisit the aspect around communities again? Because I think communities are, I guess, really important for gay men. I think I grew up in a large family, the youngest of 7 children, and I had a kind of a community in that family. But now as a 45-year-old, single gay man, I have friends and all that kind of thing, but I feel very much, I guess, out of that kind of community, really. And I just think there's enormous benefit for, say, people in my age group, say 30s, 40s, 50s, or any age group really, who I guess for helping with these kind of the stages that we're talking about, helping kind of mid or later in life. So I guess communities, may not just be, about, the type of bars you go to or your immediate friends group or anything, but even like this is a community now tonight, albeit a short-lived one for 3 hours. So I think there's enormous benefit in gay men kind of coming together like this, not in a kind of a typical kind of a social setting where you're out in bars and stuff, but this kind of, heartfelt discussion. And I think there's a lot of repairing and healing can be done in this kind of a way. So I guess that came up when we were talking about communities earlier. And I know, Walt, you said that I can't remember your exact words, but you don't really do communities or define what you do as communities. But I was wondering what you think about gay men coming together like we're doing tonight, maybe in smaller groups so that it's more intimate.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt about the importance of that, of people making connections. The thing I was talking about was a kid from Iowa flying out to San Francisco and expecting to get off the plane and walk into a community. It's something we have to find, we have to create, we have to nurture and sustain. And in the way that we have to do that with friendships, with individual friendships. So, but it's this public idea of community, that people have the idea that there's a gay community in the United States. Well, it's ridiculous. There are guys all over the place, millions of gay men all over the United States, and so that I'm talking about that popular concept of community when I say that. But no, I think, I think what Tim has done here is been remarkable. He and I have been talking about this for, I don't know, what, 4 months or 5 months or a long time. And he's done a fantastic amount of work to make this happen. But it's not like we just all ran into each other in a bar or something, right? Tim actually created it. And I think it's very valuable. As I think I mentioned it before, and I forget if I just said it to Tim or others, but I think there's a terrible deficit of older men mentoring younger men. And that I would love to see an organization that did that. And it's, there are problems there because there's a sexual implication. And the idea is not that older men do this so they can screw kids. That isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking people who really want to mentor, want to talk about their lives. And as I did mention to Tim just a short while ago, that's essentially what I do in my therapy practice. I do only 14 or 15 hours a week, but I think 5 or 6 of them are like under 33 or younger. And it's very valuable to them to have this. And but I don't think they kind of run into that in the social world.
Yeah. You're talking, Walt, you're talking about the fathering that they never really received properly, right?
Yeah, that, but then there's a step beyond that, which is someone who in some ways different from the family that they came from, has had a parallel life experience of some kind in a way that they can be helpful and supportive. And I'm trying to, I told Tim during the break that I had lunch with a couple of old friends who are like my age. They're in their 70s. We had lunch together, and they had absolutely no interest when I raised this question of younger men and mentoring and so on. They don't know anything about it. They think kids are crazy and kids use too much drugs. Kids don't appreciate the life we went through with HIV and what happened in the epidemic and so on. It's a kind of simplistic rejection of young people who need that kind of mentoring, and they need that kind of support. And you have to help the kids understand that you're not seeking sex with them. I get that from patients who say, so we start the therapy and they say, so we're not going to have any sex, right? I say, yeah, I didn't bring it up, you brought it up. No, absolutely not. That's not what this relationship is about. And so there's a lot of suspicion on young men. There's a lot of shame among older men who feel that they're old and unattractive. All of this kind of stuff. There's an area in the book, and I don't remember where I did talk about this mentoring issue and kind of what divides it. There's a chapter called Our Tripartite Communities. And sorry, I think he saw a picture of Donald Trump.
I think Leonard has a question.
I do have a question. Thank you. Well, it's more asking Walt to expand on something he says in the book. And if I may just read a few lines from the book, which also leads into that and speaks to the gentleman that asked about authenticity. It's 5 lines. And it said, authentic lives are significantly non-reactive. They are primarily rooted in an internal center rather than in others' norms and expectations. Predominantly, inauthentic lives are reactive and are decentered by external influences. In their most polarized forms among gay men, both feminine and masculine, express sensibilities suggest some reactivity. The man is not seeking himself. He is reactively embracing or rejecting the person that others expect him to be. And Walt, if I could ask you to please expand on the next sentence. So, and you say, straight looking, straight acting, and highly effeminate gay men are sometimes examples of such reactivity? And then I assume you mean inauthenticity. So perhaps you might say something about that.
I'm not quite sure what I meant by that. In that
go on.
I'd have to see it. I think that both. Let me just simplify it. Okay, very masculine-looking men and very feminine-looking men. That those are polarizations. That all of us are have a much broader potential internal life than we allow for, and that I know, obviously the gay men who try to look masculine in some conventional sense of that idea. That's obvious, but then there are gay men who are essentially pushing themselves in the faces of straight people who don't like feminine men, and so they're fighting back. Those are both reactive positions, and the closer you get to the poles, the more intense the reaction.
I just thought there might be another way to frame it as well, that it is an attempt at authenticity, because actually it's an attempt to repair a wound, because the wound to masculine and feminine, usually I think in the gay boy, is around that age of, perhaps I'm not sure where it is on Ericson's chart, but 7 or 8, where the boy realizes, I'm a boy, but I'm that sort of boy, or I'm that sort of boy. And my sense is that sort of polarization, as you call it, but it's very evident in our culture and in our communities with uber masculinity, gym workouts and uber femininity. I think it is an attempt at repair, an attempt to repair wounding at a very tender and vulnerable age of small boys. That would be my take on that.
Yeah. On what you just read there, I'm talking about grown men. I'm not talking about children.
No, I know that, but I'm saying the wound starts at the child.
Yeah.
And the grown man then is attempting to repair the wound that was inflicted upon them, perhaps by parents, by society, by culture, by community, by religion, into their masculine and feminine selves. And then as adult men, they have this opportunity to go to the extremes, to the polarization, and express this extreme masculinity or femininity. And I'm suggesting that actually can be an attempt at authenticity and an attempt at repair of a very, very deep wound.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I still think that the poles are problematic.
I think there's a book it's a line I highlighted in your book. I think there's another book in that line, because I think it's a huge piece for gay culture, not just for gay men, but for lesbians, that whole piece around masculinity and femininity, and who decides the line? Who decides the line in the expression of masculinity and femininity?
We shouldn't even have to define it.
Right, can I just comment on, because this conversation feels to me like it's in a bit of a vacuum, because actually there's quite a lot of movement away from these categorizations and into queer and non-binary identities, which, certainly in London schools and young people, it's as if they're reclaiming something from the grip of this spectrum, really, these extremes of masculinity and femininity. And so there is another kind of movement taking place, I think, in society generally around labels and around identities. So the conversation that you've just been having, I think, is being ironed out in some way, I think, or at least expanded into other discourses, other narratives around these concepts.
that it's going on organically, and actually it's not just young people, is it? Many people of different generations defining themselves in ways that are not classically masculine or feminine or male or female. And
I'm all for that.
beyond.
That's kind of what I mean by gay sensibility.
Hmm.
I mean, the non-binary thing, I think is the real pointer.
So, anything else anyone is dying
Just
to
wanted to
say?
jump in if I could.
Sure, Mike, yeah.
It is interesting because this is the largest Zoom event that I've ever been involved in, so it's got its own dynamic and own feel. It's just linked back to some thoughts and what was said about what do we mean by community. But here locally, we have our support group for gay men, Rainbow Spirit, very much influenced by the Edward Carpenter organization and philosophy. And we used to meet when we could meet at the LGBT Centre in Birmingham. Now it's all on Zoom. But the positive thing is we've managed to be creative, and at this quite difficult time of still maintaining connections with other gay men through the activities and discussions that we do during the meetings, and with an age range from probably 30 to 70. So there is a generational difference there. So I don't know whether you call it community or not, but we are coming together to share different experiences and different activities. We invited somebody. We looked at ourselves when Black Lives Matter kicked off, to look at ourselves as a group, and invited somebody, Black queer activist in the centre, to speak to us and to facilitate a discussion. And we've done other things like a quiz night and all the rest of it. So I'm just flagging it up because it's just an example of us as gay men coming together to support each other and to, in a sense, affirm each other, and about an opportunity, a space to be authentic. Because part of the structure is to have a heart circle section where people in breakout groups can have some checking in with each other and be able to speak openly from the heart and to be authentic and to have that sense of trust before we go into an activity for the second half. So it is quite amazing the way the shift from pre-lockdown to having met physically up to 25 people on a Saturday afternoon, to have found a way to be creative, to still maintain the group, and albeit by Zoom, and to share and to connect in some quite important ways. So I just wanted to share that as a positive example of what's happening, certainly here in Birmingham. And I guess because of Zoom, we've had people from Australia join us, and from mid Wales, who under normal circumstances of physically meeting wouldn't be possible. So that's been an interesting, happy accident. So I just wanted to share that that positive example of ongoing connection.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think there's been a lot of rather special connection through Zoom. I mean, it's not the same as being in person, but we've found the same too, that many people who wouldn't be able to come to our events have been able to make connection with us. So I appreciate that. So I think we're heading towards wrapping up our conversation. I just want to check if there are any kind of final thoughts, or anyone who wants to draw some conclusions or put anything, or indeed anyone who's got a final question that needs some clarification or something before we finish up for the evening.
Could I ask something, Tim?
Sure.
I think there's been quite a bit of conversation about community and the importance of that for gay men. And linking that in with the challenges that we often face as gay men connecting sex and loving intimate relationships. often because our early sexual encounters are separate from a relationship. As we develop healthy, intimate friendships with other gay men, I'm curious to explore the idea that maybe as part of that process, we have to suppress the sexual feelings that can further nourish a disconnection from intimate relationships, whether that's romantic and loving or friendships with sex. So I'm curious to consider that that's a challenge for us. And I wonder how we deal with it.
Any thoughts, Walt? I know that's a big question.
Sorry, it's a bit big at the end. I wasn't linked in, but
you know, I think it depends a lot. There are different kinds of sex. We have sex sometimes for entertainment and sport and that sort of thing. Sometimes sex is a true intimacy and a true expression of emotion. But sex is one of the ways that we communicate, and I've forgotten what there was something I wanted to say to you while you were talking, and now I've forgotten what it was. But there's a difference between having sex with a person and having sex with another's body. Those are two different things. And I think both have their place in life, and both can be valuable, and that one has to just think about what one is doing and has to have respect for the partner and the partner's intent. If you have sex with someone because they're in love with you and they want to validate the relationship and you're just in it for the body, that there's something hurtful about that. So I don't know. It's, these things vary so much with individuals. Have I answered your question or responded to it?
Yeah, I think it's given me something to think about. The idea that just have a conversation with yourself about maybe what you're doing and why, and decide and link in the emotion if it's something that you want to have, rather than just make it all sports sex, I suppose, is use it as an emotional language, rather than not just sports sex, I suppose.
Yeah, I think both are fine. I think, what bothers me is when men have grown up in that adolescent way I was described before, they're not allowed to have relationships. They're allowed to have sex behind the garage, as a replacement for relationships. Then when men grow up, they're stuck with the sports sex. And it's fine, but I think it's a bit shallow. It doesn't provide what emotional sex provides. So,
yeah, thank you.
Walt, I remember when you came over to London, I think it was in the 90s, early 90s, and you talked about your book then, and talking about being a HIV negative, the role of the HIV negative man, and all the survivor guilt and all those kind of things. It was very influential to us here, or to me, and to Loving Men. And it's been great tonight that you have brought HIV and your experience in, and very movingly, I mean, really, really movingly. And I suppose I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for that, because I think for many of us who live through that, there's that collective, consciousness and unconsciousness, and it's so enormous, really, and yet in many ways, it's in London anyway, or UK, for me, it seems to not be present. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I had, one time I was in London in those years. I'll just tell you a brief story because I found it very amusing. The NHS had released a book for gay men. And kind of, it was sort of related to my work, and my work was about the stigmatization that made self-acceptance as a gay person more difficult, and essentially something like, people take better care of something they value. And if people don't value themselves, we have a prevention problem here. So the NIH had published this book, and I went to a meeting, and I guess a guy who was the head of the NIHS was there. He's one of those British guys with a pinstripe suit and with a vest, looked very British.
Like Tim.
Like Tim?
I said, yeah, I was joking.
And so, and the cover of the thing, which you may remember, there's two naked men, one lying on top of the other. They're lying on the ground, one's on top of the other one. And their naked bodies run all the way around the book and around the backside, over the spine and around the back. And he said that this guy, the guy with the suit, said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think it's a great cover, but I can tell you in the United States, the government is never going to publish a book with two naked men lying on top of each other." And this guy, I think he took affront at what I'd said, which he misunderstood my intent. And he said, "In the United Kingdom, healthcare is for all of the Queen's subjects." And I started laughing. I mean, the idea of the Queen having subjects, is unfamiliar to an American. But it's if I tell that story to an American, they can't stop laughing. So we're the ones to talk about Donald Trump.
Thank you for another little story. I really have appreciated the little nuggets of stories and of humanity that you've brought. There's a lot here, and there's a lot in the book if people haven't read it. So I think we are going to wrap up there. Just a couple of things to mention. One is thank you very much for all the things you've been putting in the chat box. That's really is precious, and I see a lot of thanks and appreciation, and I'm touched that people have got so much out of this, and I certainly have got a lot out of this. So thank you, Walt, again for making time for us to come and do this with us.
Let me thank Tim, because Tim has done a fantastic amount of work on this, and I'm very appreciative for it. He's been working on this for months, and so thank you. You're very welcome. Something special for this.
It's been a very enjoyable process to do this with you, so thank you.
Thank
you. Bye. Thank you.